As a professional boxing trainer, Kerry Farr has worked in the corner of champions and contenders alike. Today, he shares stories of men and women who have been knocked down, but got up and kept fighting to become champions in life. With the next edition of In Your Corner, here's Kerry Farr.
Hi folks, I'm Kerry Farr. Welcome to In Your Corner. We've got a very special guest today. Jimmie Snow is with us, and I don't know if you've ever heard the name Jimmie Snow, but he's the son of the great Hank Snow, and he is a legend himself. Jimmie, it's so good to see you on In Your Corner.
Oh, Kerry, it's a pleasure being with you.
Thank you,
my brother.
I've been
looking forward to this.
Oh, not nearly as much as me. I want to go back and look at your career, because in the beginning, you were a rock and roll singer. Started out with Elvis and Jerry Lee Lewis and all of those guys. Got to take us back to the beginning and tell us about the early days of rock and roll.
Well, actually, it pretty much started with a guy named Tom Parker, Elvis Presley's manager. Well, when my dad reached his pinnacle, he was like the #1 country singer in the 50s, starting with 1951 through 1958. Those were his major years. Out of those years, my father, in his career, recorded 833 singles, which is unbelievable.
Yeah.
He's the only man that's ever been on a major label 47 years. Nobody will ever break that record, especially today.
Yeah.
And out of that, he sold 70 million records, and he had, I think, 108 albums that he had released, and received 23 gold records in his career. So he did very well.
Yes.
Well, he was at a certain point. He and Hank Williams. One year, Hank Williams would be #1 and Dad would be #2, and then it would be reversed the next year. They kind of went back and forth. And during this time, Dad was looking for a new manager, so he heard about Tom Parker, who was Eddie Arnold's manager. So he left Eddie and took over my father. Well, about the time he took my dad over, this young man in Memphis, Tennessee was becoming a rage. Now, we hadn't heard of him in Nashville. We're only 200 miles away. Somehow or another, Tom picked up on this guy, Elvis Presley I'm talking about. And as a result of that, he decided, well, we need to kind of, maybe bring him in. Now, what I mean by that is Parker and my father became co-owners of the company called Hank Snow Enterprises, Jamboree Attractions. And they were 50-50 owners of this company. So Parker said, well, I needed an act, which was my father, someone that can draw the crowds in, that we can begin to catapult some of these other people, such as Elvis Presley and myself, and their careers. Because I'd grown up in the entertainment business, so from the time I was 3 years old, that's all I'd ever known. And so he was putting on a show in Lubbock, Texas. Now, Elvis was only known in Memphis, parts of Arkansas, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, East Texas, a little bit of East New Mexico, and that was it. Nobody knew anything about him. But, he started out coming out the gate, and he was very popular with That's All Right, Mama, Blue Moon of Kentucky. What a lot of people are not aware of is that actually there was no such thing as rock and roll when Elvis came out. None of us. We were all country singers, including Elvis.
And he tried to be a country singer, right?
Yes, he did. Yeah. The thing that was so amazing was Dad was like his hero. We didn't know that until he started doing shows with Parker and with myself and with my father. And the reason was because Parker wanted Elvis to be on the shows to get him before these crowds in places where he wasn't known, to help build his career, which, was...
So would he open for your dad? Is that what it was?
That was pretty much it, yeah, for a while.
He was the opening act for Hank Snow. How about that?
Snow. And I was on there as an opening act, and we would have others like the Carter family and probably Fair and Young or Marty Robbins. They weren't as big yet, but they would be on there. And some may remember Whitey Ford, a Grand Ole Opry comedian known as the Duke of Paducah. He was on some of the shows, and there'd be different ones. We go out as packages. And with what Parker and Dad would do is they put up the money. They were supposed to put up the money together to put these package shows on in these different venues to get all of us a lot of exposure. And so what happened, though, Elvis became such a sensation. He would close the first half of the show at the time of the intermission. People wouldn't let him off the stage. It didn't matter that they didn't know him. He was one of those.
Something so new and
absolutely.
so different.
He was so charismatic, a very handsome fella, and such a wonderful voice that his style and the way he moved around and everything, which was brand new to the day. But he was introduced on Louisiana Hayride, which he became part of, as a rockabilly singer, because they didn't know what to call him. Mm-hmm. And so that it went all of a sudden, back then it was called hillbilly music.
Right.
There was no such thing as country. That came along a little later as country and western because of western swing music that identified. So the evolution of it would be kind of like this: hillbilly, rockabilly, country and western, then country music. With the rock side of it, it was hillbilly, rockabilly, rock and roll. Now, a lot of people would argue the issue that Elvis Presley would not necessarily be coined as the king of rock and roll, because a lot of people have come along since then that sold more records, and he died very young, didn't accomplish what a lot of them accomplished, and they would argue that point. But Elvis was able to do something these men couldn't do. That is, he was able to tie these different genres of music into one. Like country music had its own world in Billboard, rhythm and blues, pop, and so forth.
So when he came along,
yes,
all of these guys, like you say, the rhythm and blues. I'm trying to think of some of the names from back then, but
Bill Haley and the Comets,
Chuck Berry, and Elvis, and then Jerry Lee Lewis, and all of these.
All
guys.
of them, yeah, right, and Carl Perkins. And so what happened was, when he put out a hit record, you could see it as in the top 5 or 10 in pop, rhythm and blues, all over the charts.
Yeah.
And he tied them together so that even today, if you have a big hit record in country, it may show up in the pop or in the rhythm and blues or wherever today. So I think that's probably what brought about the idea that he was the king of rock and roll.
And Jimmie is the son of the great country music singer Hank Snow, and had an incredible amount of hits, his dad did. But Jimmie was a rock and roll singer and friends with Elvis Presley back in the day.
And the thing that was so astounding was, I was sent, my first meeting with Elvis was 1955. I was sent to do a show with him in February, be his opening act in Lubbock, Texas. But I was sent by Tom Parker to carry a letter of intent. They had been communicating about trying to become part of the company that Dad and Parker owned.
So this was supposed to have been your dad and Parker.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
They were supposed to be 50-50. I actually have a copy of the contract between Parker and Dad with the canceled check, signature on the back by Parker, and where it states 4, it actually says, Dad writes, I am now a 50% owner of Jamboree Attractions, Hank Snow Enterprises. I have that in my possession. So I went out there anyway. I was really shocked. I didn't know what to expect. And he had a chartreuse jacket on, I remember that. It looked yellow, but it was chartreuse. Black pants with white stripes down the side. And once I got through, I stood on the wings there to watch him. About 1,000 people in that place, and man, here he went. And when he hit that stage, he electrified that audience, something I wasn't really used to. And we always identify Elvis with teeny boppers, but that's not necessarily true. I saw women in their 30s and 40s jumping out in the aisles, and I mean, what we're used to seeing today, they were doing in 55.
Yeah.
And of course, the teeny boppers were involved too, the teenage time. But it affected the audience. He had an effect, a charismatic effect on that audience. Well, I immediately, I loved him immediately. And he was a very nice, warm person. He didn't drink, he didn't smoke, he didn't curse, he didn't do any of those things. I did, but he didn't.
Yeah.
And I was quite amazed. He was an Assembly of God. He was a Pentecostal boy, raised in a very, at that day, legalistic church.
Yes.
Because Pentecost in its beginning was quite legalistic.
Right.
And he understood that world, even though he didn't stay in it, he understood it. So he was a real gentleman. All of the things that may happen to him we read about in his latter years, I can't speak for. But I know I liked him, and certainly admired his ability to sing. And he used to use that kind of a gimmick at that time that Sam Phillips over in Memphis brought up called Slapback Echo, which kind of makes your voice, where you say a word and it goes, yeah, like that.
Oh, yeah.
So, he had that style already. Later on, he quit doing that. His voice was so good, he didn't have to have any kind of, if you want to call it a gimmick. And we were working a lot of shows at that time. And so he became part of Jamboree Attractions. And wherever we went, he would close the first half. Well, he was going so long that my dad finally had to make a decision. Dad was a stand-up country singer. Elvis moved all over the place.
Yeah.
Crowds went crazy. They wouldn't let him off the stage. So Dad finally had to say, Elvis, I'm going to let you close the show, which in that day and time was always for the star.
Yeah.
Dad was the star. And Elvis said, okay. He didn't mind. He said, that way you can stay on stage as long as you want.
That's hilarious.
Now, a story went around a little bit later where people were saying, that Dad got mad because he made the show go too long. That was really not true, because Dad, if there was anything he wanted him to succeed, because the more fame he got,
part of it, yeah.
the more money Jamboree Attractions, Hank Snow Enterprises would get. So you know how stories are. So that went around for a while, but it was basically because of the length of the show. He closed it. And a funny thing I always talk about is the fact that we were doing the shows. We were working with people like Andy Griffith, who was a stand-up comedian before he was an actor, and he was doing shows with us at the time. Tommy Sands, Gene Vincent, the Bebopaloo guy, all of these different people, Carl Perkins. One of the things that stands out most in my mind is the fact that not only was Elvis starting out as a country singer who memorized almost all of my dad's hits.
Wow.
He used to come out to the house and he'd sit there at the piano, and he always would sit at the piano and sing for Dad and I.
And he could play the piano.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And just chording mainly.
Yeah.
And he'd come out singing one of Dad's songs from the 40s. And Dad would go, it amazed him, because he wasn't expecting this moving around type
this young
singer.
rocker to be able to sing his music.
Singing songs that were not even hits in the United States from Canada.
Did he ever sing "I've Been Everywhere, Man"? I mean, nobody could do that like your dad.
Well, that came along after we all went our own ways. But he was something else. And so we'd ride around Nashville a lot of times on the motorcycles that I owned and go in drugstores and things of that sort. I often wondered if people really knew that Elvis Presley had come into the establishments around Madison here, different places in Nashville. But we worked a lot of tours together, and one of the things that stands out in my mind is at the same time, this guy, Bill Haley, in the Comets, he had a mega hit called Rock Around the Clock.
Right.
It wound up, becoming the theme song in the Academy Award-winning movie Blackboard Jungle. And I traveled on an entire 20, 30-day tour with him, and he told me himself that he was a country singer. He sang in nightclubs in Pennsylvania. But all of a sudden, because he come out with Blackboard Jungle, which got identified with the rebellious movie,
right,
in the sex revolution of that day among teenagers, that immediately he was considered a rock and roll singer too.
Wow.
But he'd do his song, and then all of a sudden the saxophone player would go wild, and he'd go down into the audience, and the bass player with the big upright would go down there, and the saxophone player would straddle the bass like a horse, and the bass player would drag him up down the aisle, and the audience would go nuts.
My goodness.
That was his gimmick.
Wow.
And the drummer would play, and this stands out. I'm standing right there at the wings watching the drummer. Probably used thinner sticks because he made sure he'd break them when he'd really play those drums during that song. Without missing a beat, he'd go with his hands, and he'd cut his hands on the cymbals, and when the blood would get on his cymbals and on his drums, they'd go nuts.
But Jimmy, sitting here talking about Elvis and your relationship with Elvis, he'd come visit you, your dad sent you out on the road, and Colonel Parker sent you out on the road to sign Elvis, and you and him were friends, and you'd go around and ride motorcycles in the early days. But something happened in your life. I mean, you can talk a little bit more about Elvis, but you gave up rock and roll.
Yes. Well, of course, I was a country singer. Last few that I did, records on RCA, everybody wanted to be like Elvis. So I was trying to sing like him. I never accomplished the same thing, but The last two records that I had, Love Me and How Do You Think I Feel, he covered those records later and became monstrous hits. But they were good enough for me to get my new contract. I would go to his house occasionally to visit. So in 1958, in January, now I had a car wreck in 1956. I was a heavy drinker and I was on drugs for a while. 7 years of drinking, 2 years of drugs. And I was on this side making good money.
In the music business?
In the music business. On this side, I was living miserably, which proves that things are not what satisfy life.
Right.
And I had been saved when I was a child, but I got away from God very quickly and went into sin and into all this drinking. But I just, it would gnaw at me. Because God had his hand on my life. He wanted me to be a preacher. He called me. I believe there are two kinds of preachers. I believe there are those who live a good life in church all their life. They look around to choose a vocation. They choose the ministry. But I also believe that there are people that God raises up to be in ministry. And I feel always that I always felt different even when I was a little boy. And Elvis invited me to come. I got a call from him. He wanted me to come. He was already a big star now. Jailhouse Rock was out, Love Me Tender, all that was out. He called me up and he wanted me to come spend a few days with him. So the first 10 days of January, I flew to Memphis. He picked me up just to hang out. We'd run around all night.
Let's go back and examine that for just a minute.
Okay.
Nobody else would pay any attention to this, but since I live in Nashville and we've got the interstate now, it's a 3.5-hour drive today. But back in those days, you boarded a plane to go from Nashville to Memphis. I guess those country roads in those days were hard to travel.
They were a little different.
So you flew over to Memphis, and then you and him started hanging out.
And he couldn't go anywhere now during the day, mobbed. So he'd rent the movie theater all night. So he had his Memphis Mafia at that time, which I learned about later. So 15 or 20 of us, we'd all pile into the movie theater. He'd pay the popcorn girl, the ushers, everybody that worked there to stay all night. Evidently paid them well. So we'd watch movies. We watched Jailhouse Rock. I remember that. It had just come out. We watched that movie. And something else, I don't remember the name of the other one. We get back about 5 o'clock in the morning, go to bed, sleep half the day, go downstairs, eat a bite, and sit around the piano and sing, play, which was one of the things he loved to do. Do the same thing that night, roller skating rink, something different every night. And the main reason he brought me over there was he was making a movie called King Creole, and he had a part in it for me, which that was my dream, to go also into movies. I had signed up with Actors Studio. I had just gotten back in fall of 1957, but when I had this wreck, to jump back a little bit, that took me out of circulation in 1956 from January all the way to summer. I couldn't travel on the road, I couldn't work shows. Dad and Elvis, they were still working, but I couldn't anymore. I couldn't go anywhere. I had a terrible wreck. And it's a wonder that I didn't die. I would have gone into the armed forces if it hadn't been for that wreck. God just stopped me, and I had a chance to really think about my life and my direction.
While you were in the hospital?
Yeah.
Because you were near death?
Near death.
Yeah.
I almost lost my right leg. So I went back into the business when I got back on my feet, and I did the Lawrence Welk television show in September of 1957. That did a lot for me because they didn't have 100 channels then.
Right.
NBC, CBS was just
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah.
And millions watched because Welk was popular. And that just opened doors up for me. So I was on my way. You know, the devil's good, isn't he?
Amen.
He's slick. So here I am now in a catch-22. One side of my heart is tearing at me to come back to God. The other side is saying,
and the world is offering you fame and fortune, and Elvis Presley is offering you a part in a movie.
In a movie. And he gave me the script to read it every morning when we'd come back on our all-night deals. And I'd read 4 or 5 pages. And at the end of my time there, I caught myself doing something I wasn't expecting. He said, Jimmy, he said, what do you think of the movie? I said, Elvis, this is great. Going to be your best, which turned out it was one of his best acting.
I think so, yeah.
And he said, well, do you want that part right there? And man, I I just stood there and looked at him because that was my dream. And I said, Elvis, if you'd have asked me 6 months ago, I would have jumped at that. But I said, you know, I'm going home and I'm quitting my career and I'm going to go into the ministry.
Going to give my life totally and completely to Jesus Christ. And Jimmy, we've got about 1 minute left. Talk to people about the world and you know the things that Satan offers and how much better it is with Christ.
Well, I can tell you right now, I had it. I had everything that people dream to have. If that's where it was, I'd still be in it. But that's not where it's at, especially in my life. I suddenly realized that happiness does not consist in things, but in relationships, and especially that relationship that you can have with Jesus Christ. And when I turned my life over to Him, it hasn't been easy. I don't have the accolades that I had then. I don't have the recording contracts that I had then. I don't even have the money, the $350 a day that I was making back in those days with no overhead. I don't have that anymore. As a matter of fact, I don't have nearly anything. But I have something inside that money can't buy. Even through my hard times, even through my difficult times, 2 years of recuperating from surgery that I've had back 2 years ago, I can still tell you that Jesus is the only way.
Wow. Okay, friends, thank you so much for listening to the podcast today. I hope you enjoyed Jimmie Snow's story about him, Elvis, and his dad, Hank Snow, as much as I did. We'll look forward to seeing you again next time on the next edition of In Your Corner.